Guys, attendance enabled. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Attendance is enabled. We'll wait for a couple of more minutes. Okay, regarding the labs this week, there are some issues with the scheduling because I think some of the TAs are not free at the lab timings. So what I've asked them to do is something like this. I will share a problem for you guys, as you guys know that these problems, it's not really required for for you to submit the solutions for this. And this week it will be just a C problem because we haven't done any C++ as of now. So I'll just give away a simple C program. The idea is for each student in this semester there will be a mentor. So it's like there will be a TA who's going to be with you throughout the semester. Okay, that TA is going to be like your second point of contact other than me. And your practice labs will always be taken up by that particular TA. During the lab exams you will be evaluated by some other TA, but there is going to be one mentor for you throughout the semester, and you guys should have a good communication with your mentor. So this week I've asked all the TAs to send emails to their batches, so you should hear from your TAs. Try to do that code on your own. This week we may not actually have the sessions as such, right? So it is not probably possible for them to uh, arrange a Google meeting and have the lab because of scheduling problems. But you can approach them. So let us say you try to do the problem on your own and you get stuck somewhere. Then you can ask your mentors to help you out. Okay? And from next week onwards, we are trying to reschedule the labs at a time so that they are free. That will require changes in the timetable. I have already initiated the request for that. So by next week, we should be able to have these 2 hour practice labs where you try to write the code within 2 hours, and then if you get stuck, you can ask the TAs. But this week, it's more like an offline lab. You can ask your mentors for any help if you want. Okay. Okay, how many people are there now? Yeah, I think we can start. More than 80 people. Okay, let's start. And as usual, during a live lecture, I will not be seeing the chats. So if you have a question, you have to unmute yourself and ask. Okay, so if you remember the first in the first week, I talked about how this particular subject, this particular course, is not just about coding. It's basically about building systems, right? I told you that maybe the equivalent of object-oriented modeling in the competitive coding world is data structures. So, um, from the perspective of your jobs and placements and stuff, they have different roles. The system building skills are more useful when you actually try to do an internship or when you finally get a job and you go and join the company, whereas the competitive coding skills are more uh, required for you in order to get the job, right? So they are both important anyhow. So when we talk about building a system, when we talk about building a software, um, there are some processes which are not really coding. Okay, and this subject, it actually tries to teach you those techniques first, right? So in order to begin learning some of these techniques, first you should have an overview of what exactly is it to build a software, right? So we call something known as software development life cycle, or SDLC. And you'll read about SDLC in detail in your subject on software engineering. But I thought you should at least have a idea of what exactly are you learning in this course, right? So basically what we are going to do in this course is that we are going to learn about a very specific phase of SDLC. Okay, the complete SDLC you are going to study in software engineering, but we are going to study about one particular phase in SDLC. Okay. Okay, so let's start from the very basics, like what exactly is a software, right? So there are no hard definitions of software. That is the first problem. There are many colloquial definitions. So, for example, when I was in school, people had an idea that software basically means everything that you cannot see in a computer. That was what people said, right? So essentially, everything that you can physically see, touch, okay, that is hardware. So according to them, keyboard, mouse, monitor. Of course, they considered monitor to be a part of the computer. They considered keyboard to be a part of computer. They considered mouse to be a part of the computer, and then things like RAM and processor and buses and everything. So this the people the people's definition of hardware was that everything that you can see and touch is basically hardware, and then whatever you cannot see with your naked eye, right, that is software. Again, this is a very creepy kind of a definition, but this is how people used to define, right? Because we never really had a globally agreed upon definition for software, right? So this is the problem. So but for our job, a very simple a working definition could be: a software is a collection of programs along with some suitable documentation. Okay, so there are 2 points in this definition that are worth having a look at. So first, I've used the word collection of programs, right? So in previous semester during ITP, you usually wrote code which can be considered as one program, right? I mean, you wrote something in one .c file. Maybe towards the end we actually looked at how to use header files and distribute the code uh, in into multiple coding files, but we didn't really pursue that to a greater detail. We basically said, okay, even if we are putting some code in another file, like in a header file, that was like very basic code, and we simply included the header file in the C file and then did some code. But so essentially, it was just one simple program, right, which we could have split across multiple files. But when you talk about software in general, there are like multiple programs. Okay, they are all doing something specific, and they all have to come together. They have to like collaborate with each other. That is why collaborating part is also an important part here, that they have to somehow collaborate with each other in order to give out a packaged functionality. Okay, and the simplest case, like let us try to understand. You guys use things like VS Code, right? So what all things do you do in VS Code? You can open a file, you can browse through the directory, you can compile, you can run the code. So there are so many different things that you do in VS Code, right? And I know most probably this code is not written in one .c or one .cpp or one .python file, .py file, right? There are like different files, and different features of VS Code are actually written into different files, and they somehow, at the runtime when you open up VS Code, it looks like it is just one program, that is one large program that is running, and you are accessing different parts of that program. So this is the idea of a software, that not only are you going to write one program, you're going to write multiple programs, and they need to somehow collaborate with each other, so that the user of your software does not know, whether it is a single program, whether there are multiple programs. The idea is for the user, it is one entity. Okay? The second aspect of software, which is very important, is that software usually is accompanied by some documentation. Okay, some documents have to be there. This is the practice, right? So let us say you are going to go to some firm for internship, maybe, I guess, what, in third year, or there are some guys who go for an internship after second year as well. But at least I think after third year you are certainly going to go to some company for doing an internship. So in that case, the company, in the company you will be given some task, and they don't really expect just the code from you. Okay, they will ask you to write some documents along with it as well. Okay, first of all, you'll have to write some comments within your code, so that your code is understandable to someone else as well. And at the same time, they might also ask you to build some documents, right? There's some documents that define what exactly have you done. So a software is basically a collection of all these things. There are programs and there are some documents which actually tell you how these programs work, right? And by the way, the plural of software is also software. So sometimes I might use a software, sometimes I might use software. Don't be confused. Basically, they are the same. They are like the same words are used. The same word is used for both singular and plural forms. Now, when you are given the task of building a software, uh, there are actually many steps that are involved, right? Especially if you are building a commercial software, something that is um, going to be, right, put in the market, and there has to be some money, some cost associated with it. So there are multiple steps involved in this. The actual number of steps which are discussed in literature, again, there is no standardization as such, that these are exactly the steps that you should follow. But whatever steps are there, you can probably group them into three phases. Okay, these phases actually happen in some kind of a cycle. Why? Because usually when you build a software, um, it's not it's it seldom happens that there is just one version, right? So for example, even for your VS Code and all the code, all the editors that you guys use, right? You must have seen that there are versions. Okay, so if you are using version X right now, maybe after a few months you might be using version Y, something like this, right? So that is the idea, that whenever you start developing a software, there is a kind of a life cycle that you are expecting the software to be alive for certain number of years. Okay, sometimes you might actually decide to stop the software in between. So for example, we no longer have support for Windows 7, if I'm not wrong. So yeah, Microsoft stopped. Why? Because basically if they don't stop Windows 7, people won't buy Windows 10. So there might be certain business decisions because of which you may stop the development of a software. But usually, even when throughout its lifetime, there will be multiple versions of that software. So there will be, so this whole development, right, it happens through multiple cycles. Okay, we'll keep on repeating these cycles. So in the first phase, the overall idea is basically to analyze what the problem is and then prepare some kind of a plan, like what exactly are we going to do. And typical things that we do in this phase is that we see if the project is actually feasible to do or not. Okay, this is a very important aspect. Whenever you take up a project, the first thing you need to know is whether it is even doable by you or not, right? um, because let us assume that you are going to join some company, and your skill set includes, let us say, C++, and Python, for example, right? But the project that this company has currently, you are required to code in Ruby on Rails. Okay, so now even though you are a good programmer, you are not directly deployable on that project, right? You'll first have to learn the Ruby on Rails syntax. It might take you some time to pick up the syntax, right? So even though you are available as a resource for that particular project, you are not useful, right? Similarly, it is possible that for building a particular project, you need, let us say, 5 or 6 GPUs. Okay, and currently you do not have enough funds to actually procure those many number of GPUs, right? So even though you actually know how to write code and get this project done, there are like cost related problems with you that you cannot, because of which this project is not feasible for you. So so in the beginning of each software project, we start with these kind of analysis, that whether this project is even feasible for us or not, right? There might be multiple dimensions in which we have to figure out whether it is feasible for us or not. Maybe the people I have, they don't know that particular language in which the project is supposed to be built. Maybe I don't have enough hardware resources. Maybe I don't have, my team is already occupied with some other projects, so they cannot find so much amount of time. So overall, you have to do some kind of a feasibility study. Let us say the project is feasible. So in that case, you have to chalk out a plan as in, okay, what is the amount of time we are going to take? Okay, well, whether are we planning to build it in 1 month or 3 months or 1 year? Okay, what is the amount of time it will take us, right? How many people are going to be involved? Whether it's a single project, single person project, 10% project, 50% project. Basically, I have to do some planning in order to figure out how much is required to do this project. And this is the main part, and this is the part basically which we are going to study in this course. We then come up with some kind of sketches and documents in order to, uh, this is like a pre-coding phase, that before we start coding, we prepare certain documents with the help of which the developers will be, given some guidelines to code. Okay, and this is the part where we are going to, which we are going to cover mostly in this course. The second phase, of course, is once you're done with all this planning, you actually start writing code. Now another aspect of system building, and this is what I said in the previous week as well. When you're trying to build a system, it's not really necessary that you write all the code. Okay, in fact, if you can find a library that does exactly the same thing as required for you, it is almost always better to use the library rather than writing the code yourself. Okay, because there's a good chance that the library has been used by multiple people, if there was any problems, there were any bugs, they might have been removed. Okay, so there is a good chance that if it's a popular library, it is going to work as expected. On the other hand, even if you are one of the best coders out there, you are still, prone to human errors. So there is a good chance that if you write the code, the amount of testing that you'll have to do will be huge, right? So when we talk about implementation, the idea is I somehow have to get that code assembled together. It could either be written by developers themselves, or we can figure out how to get it from some third party. But the overall idea is that I have to collect the amount of code that is required to achieve everything that this software is supposed to do. Then we also have to test everything, right? So even if we are using a third party library, there are still certain kinds of tests that I have to do, okay, so that I am absolutely sure that this is what I expected and this is what I am getting. And then once you have built all this, right, you actually deploy or release the software. When I say deploy, it means that sometimes we build software for certain firms, right? So all these IT companies, Infosys, TCS, um, Cognizant, these Indian IT companies, do you know they are basically service oriented companies, right? So they actually try to get some clients. Their biggest clients have always been the banks, for example, across the world, not just Indian banks. They work for banks across the world, and they say, okay, let us say you want to automate all your processes. We are going to give you software solutions to do that, right? So this is known as bespoke development, where I basically talk to a client. The client tells me this is what is expected from the software solution, and then i I create a customized solution for the client, okay, and then deploy it on the client's premises. The other type of software are basically software products. So for example, Microsoft doesn't really deploy Windows on your machine, right? Microsoft releases a new version of Windows. If you want to use that, you have to buy it, and then you can install it on your own machine. So the idea is that once the coding and testing and everything is done, I have to either release the software or deploy it. And then uh, this is another aspect a lot of developers do not understand this, that building the software is probably just, let us say, 20 to 30% of the work. The rest is maintaining the software, that you have to maintain the software over long periods of time. So let us say the user started using it. There might be some bugs that get discovered, that if I do this that and this, your application exits. Okay, so you need to have a mechanism where the user can report bugs. Second, the user may actually come up with some suggestions that, hey, I want certain improvements in the code, okay, in which case you have to figure out how to improve your code. So this is known as the maintenance task, that you have to somehow do maintenance of your work. And this is what is usually, it usually takes up more time. Sorry, it usually takes up more time than creating and building the software. So like these are the three overall phases in which software development works. You basically plan, you then write some code or implement it, and then you release and maintain it. Now, the actual term is for this is known as software development life cycle. Um, there are multiple phases that this SDLC defines. I don't really want you to go into details of what SDLC is. Maybe just read a few articles, that is fine. But you will study about SDLC in detail when you do a course on software engineering. But overall, the idea is something like this: that uh, the actual steps of development are not necessarily the same as defined in SDLC, but they usually somehow correspond to these steps. So if it's a small project, for example, your planning and your analysis might be very small, okay, very brief. Maybe you just sit for 2 hours and all your analysis is done. If it's a large project, maybe you'll analyze for 2 months, not 2 hours. Things like this. But the idea is that you start by analyzing the requirements of the project. especially checking for the feasibility. You create some initial design documents, okay, and this is mostly like it's like a bird's eye view of the software, and then you actually keep on designing the software in more detail, okay, with sufficiently detailed design documents. And in this course we are going to look at these sufficiently detailed design documents. What exactly do they mean? In the implementation phase, as I said, right, you basically write code and you try to find out binaries as in these libraries that you guys use, and somehow stick them together. Okay, the idea is to write uh, glue code. The term is glue code. So a lot of system builders, they don't really write a lot of code, they write glue code. So what do I mean by glue code? Basically code that glues together different parts, okay, and then it prepares one system out of it. So one of the skills that you have to develop as a system builder is to know how to write glue code. So this is significantly different from, let us say, solving a problem using data structures. So this, but in the implementation part, this is the idea that you basically write or integrate code, then you test it properly. This testing has to be done at multiple levels. So you test individual programs, you test a group of programs, you test the whole system end to end. So a number of testing uh, scenarios are there. You will study all these in software engineering. Then in the maintenance phase, you simply deploy the software, you plan for the next cycle. What is it that you are supposed to do in the next cycle? You weed out existing problems. If there is a problem that is reported by the user, you issue patches. You would have heard this term patch. So these patches are essentially solutions to existing bugs. So in the newer versions there is a patch for sorting out the problems within existing version. So now there is something known as the waterfall model of development. Okay, so SDLC is, let us say, a philosophy, and waterfall model is an actual model that is built on that philosophy. So the waterfall model is probably the simplest model that software engineering teaches you in order to build a software. The waterfall model defines the steps involved in software development in a sequential order. So there is no cycle. That is the first thing you have to understand. In waterfall model, there is no cycle. It's supposed you are it is expected that your software is simple enough to be built in just one iteration. You're not going to do multiple cycles. It's like just one iteration. So it is actually. Does anyone have a query? I could hear someone's mic open. Anyhow, so this is basically similar to how water will fall from the top of a waterfall and then simply flows through to the bottom. So this is the idea that basically this is where your water is, and it keeps on falling like this, you know. So this is known as the waterfall model. And what exactly does it have? So basically you do requirement analysis. Requirement analysis means you actually analyze all the requirements that are there for your software. Then you do some designing. I will study more about designing in this subject. Then implementation is essentially coding or finding out third party libraries that do your job. Then some testing, and then some maintenance. The actual steps, again, in literature you might find multiple multiple forms of waterfall model, but this is just the gist of it, that in a waterfall model we do stuff in a sequential fashion. There is no iteration, there is no cycle. We start from requirement analysis and we move up to maintenance. This is the idea of the waterfall model. Now within this whole cycle, the only part that we are going to study in a little more detail in this course is the design phase, where we are going to write some where we are going to know how to create certain design documents. So these design documents in some ways are actually equivalent to the algorithms that you used to have, right? This is how we started coding, right? I mean, in the beginning of ITP, um, you saw that we tried with we started with algorithms and then pseudocode and then finally code, right? So I said that pseudocode is slightly closer to the actual programming language that you are trying to do. Algorithms, they are basically, there is no level defined for it, right? I mean, algorithms could be too detailed, or someone's mic is on. Please check your mics. Okay. So remember, right, that algorithms could either be too detailed or they could be too brief. So similarly, these design documents, right, they can either be at a very high level where they are just conveying some uh, let's say, whether they are trying to represent the software at a very high level. We usually call these kind of documents as architectural documents, or they could be at a very low level where I basically say, this is the program, that this program is going to talk to this program. This program will be on machine 1, this program will be on machine 2, so on and so forth. So it could be a detailed design document as well. But overall, the idea of this whole design phase is to come up with certain documents which are going to be the guidelines for my developers. Now, one such element that I actually uh, create during the design of my software, especially if I'm planning to build the software using object oriented approach, is class. Okay, so we will discuss them later, what exactly classes are. But the idea is we create things like class diagrams in order to um, define how exactly is my software going to be built. So this is an example of how a class diagram looks like. So let us say you have this, let's take the example of triple IT. So you have a course. This course, how do you define what a course is, right? So a course has a name, it has an ID, things like this, and there is a faculty who's teaching that particular course. It has certain number of credits associated with it, and then there are some functions that are associated with the course, right? So basically you can write a function which says, if I give you a roll number, can you please tell me when are the lectures for these roll numbers, this particular roll number, right? So for example, in your case you have two batches, right? CSAI plus and IT plus. So if you give me a roll number, I can tell you which of the two schedules it is, whether it is for CSAI plus or whether it is for IT plus. So you can consider this to be a kind of a function. You give me a roll number and you tell me this is as this roll number and this course ID, and I can tell you what is the lecture schedule. Similarly, you can have a lab schedule, something like this. For a student, what are the typical things that are associated with a student, right? So you have a name, a roll number, you have some semester in which you are currently studying. There are actually many other things, right? And what are the typical things that a student is supposed to do? You have to register for a particular semester, you have to enroll in a particular course. I don't know what is the registration process here in triple IT, but in many institutes you have to actually uh, register for courses explicitly. Even if it is a compulsory course, you have to explicitly register for it. And then similarly there is a faculty, right? The faculty has some employee ID, stuff like that. So what exactly does this diagram really represent? It is not really code, right? It is in some ways going to give me an idea that if I have to write code, maybe I have to write some code for student, I have to write some code for courses, I have to write some code for faculty members. Okay, and then somehow these guys are not really independent, they are dependent on each other. So for example, in one course, there will be more than one student, right? So there will be like m, so this there is there is an 1 to m relationship here. Actually I should have written n usually is a better word, but weather term, but basically this relationship is 1 to m. That means that for one course there will be more than one students, and this relationship is a 1 to 1 relationship. I know that it's for some courses you have two faculty members, but let us say in the general case, this has a 1 to 1 relationship, that one course is taught by one faculty member. Okay, and usually one faculty member, I'm especially talking about visiting faculties like me. So one faculty member will teach only one course. So there's a 1 to 1 relationship, something like this. So this is a very imperfect class diagram. We are not saying It's perfect because you'll see what class diagrams look like. But this is just to give you an idea of what these design documents look like. Okay, they are not code. They are in some ways, the equivalent of an algorithm that you're trying to show. This is what my system will have at the code level. Now, there is one more thing that we have to discuss, the concept of imperative and declarative paradigms, right? So, the imperative paradigm of programming, it only focuses on how it actually focuses on how the goals are achieved. Okay, we provide all the details of the communication. I'll just give you an example. Whereas the declarative paradigm focuses on defining what the goals are. We assume that the goals can be achieved somehow. We don't care about the details as long as we get the required results. This is an example. Okay, let us say you have written a factorial program. Okay, this factorial program you guys have written multiple times. So what is the difference between these two code fragments? Okay, here I'm actually um, putting the whole process of calculating factorial here itself, whereas here I've simply declared, or maybe this factorial function is coming from a library, and all I do is long factorial equal to factorial num, right? What is the difference here? The difference, of course, is, how exactly are we going to achieve our goals. This is shown here, right? I mean, I'm actually writing the whole code, or basically I'm trying to show you the whole process of how factorial is being achieved. Okay, so this is the imperative approach, where I am, as a developer, I'm interested in seeing how exactly things are done. In the declarative approach, we don't really care about how things are achieved as long as they are somehow achieved. So it is that is the idea, that basically, in the competitive coding world, you usually go for the imperative approach. You write the code on your own. In the system building arena, you usually take the declarative approach. If I can find a function which achieves everything that I want, I don't care, right? I don't want to check. We actually did this with the sqrt function, if you remember, right? We never really looked at how sqrt function is implemented, but we simply trusted the guys who wrote sqrt, and we simply used it. So this is more of a declarative approach. So you can understand that there is a level of abstraction here. What does it mean by level of abstraction? Some people might even say that then in that case, if you are really going for an imperative approach, why do you even use printf? Okay, figure out your own, write your own code to print something on the screen as well. But you might say, no, maybe printf, I'm okay with printf. I don't care how printf works, but everything else I will write a code for it. So this is like, so you can understand that it's not a perfect system. You have to define the level to which you want to go as far as the details are concerned. So there is a level of abstraction, and this is basically relative, right? I mean, relative as in you decide what is imperative and what is declarative. But these are two ways of thinking about coding. The declarative paradigm says that I don't care about the details, I just care about the results. The imperative paradigm says that I want to figure out this problem from bottom, top to bottom. I need to know how exactly was it solved. So, in this abstraction hierarchy, different languages give you different levels of freedom, or whatever you call it. Basically, Java and C++ are somehow, in the middle of this hierarchy, whereas C is somehow somewhat below Java, and C++. MATLAB is probably arguably much higher. So all these newer languages, MATLAB, of course, is a very advanced language. So the idea is that in MATLAB you have functions for almost everything. You don't really need to write code for it. There are languages like PHP, where there is a saying that, anything that you want to do in PHP, just go and type on the Google, and there will be a function for it. I think Python also has reached that level, that there are so many libraries in Python, so many third party libraries, that whatever you want to do in Python, there will be like some function to do that. C is not like that. C, there is a good chance that whatever you are trying to do, you have to write that code on your own. So this is more of an imperative versus declarative approach, right? So this is it. There is some homework. Please have a look at it. This is the lecture for us. Any queries now? Let me also check the chats. Okay, so I know that this subject is probably not the same as introduction to programming, because you can already see that there are more concepts, and sometimes you might feel I'm just teaching you philosophy. Um, but these philosophies are actually important, because um, I usually try to give you idea of how the actual world will look like when you go out there. So from that perspective, this subject is important, because you will learn things which are more important for you from industry perspective. Okay, so all these SDLC and everything, um, nobody's going to teach you this. You have to learn it on your own. And unfortunately, in many institutes, um, during the software engineering course, they actually go through these things at a very brisk pace. They don't actually spend so much amount of time on design. So this is your time to learn designing, this in my view. So uh, so use this subject as a way to practice your designing skills. Okay, and you might actually be able to surprise your project managers in your company. The manager might not actually expect you guys to do so well in designing, but if you are well versed in designing, you might say, okay, give me the problem, I'll submit a design document to you, and your project manager might actually be very happy with it. Okay, any queries? uh, Yeah, yeah. So, Nehal, basically, whenever we build a software, right? What exactly is who are our target audience? This is a very important aspect, right? So, for example, who's the target audience for Microsoft? When Microsoft thinks about coming up with a new version of Windows or Office, who's their target audience? It's not like a particular company or a set of people. It's for the general population, right? They build software for general population. So they don't really come to your house and ask you, shall I install Windows on your system, shall I upgrade Windows on your system? No, they simply say, okay, there is a new version of Windows that is available. In some cases they'll give you a free upgrade. In other cases they might actually say you have to pay this much amount of money, and if you pay that much amount of money, you can take up the software and install it on your system. For corporate cases, I think they actually take contracts where, yeah, for corporate cases, they also give Windows and Office on a service basis as well. So there, you can actually purchase a license from Microsoft, and they'll take care that all your systems are upgraded, and all the security patches are added. Microsoft, can basically do the maintenance of the product at your end as well. In fact, if I'm not wrong, Windows XP, it was the previous version of Windows. I don't know how many of you have used Windows XP. When I got my first PC, it had Windows XP on it, and I still actually like Windows XP much better than Windows 7, and Windows 7 is actually fine. But from Windows 8 onwards, I've simply gotten disconnected from the Windows world. It's too much for me to handle. Windows 7 is probably the last sane version of Windows that I have used. Anyhow, so Windows XP, a lot of these ATMs, right, throughout the country, they actually used to run on Windows XP. I'm not sure whether they are still running on Windows XP or not, but a lot of ATMs, a lot of systems that you might have seen in these shopping malls, right? They have a small computer which has a barcode reader attached to it, and they scan your products, and then a bill comes up on the screen. All these systems used to run on Windows XP, but Microsoft said that we are going to end Windows XP support. I think sometime around, what, 2012, 13, somewhere there, they ended Windows XP support, but they actually continued supporting commercial versions of Windows XP for a much longer period. Okay, even though the general updates stopped to Windows XP, they actually supported the commercial versions, the ones which were bought by businesses, for a much longer period. And this is where there is a difference between the service industry and the software product industry. When you build a software product, you basically build it in general for the general population. You don't you don't really go and deploy it anywhere. You might provide people the option of buying some kind of a corporate level solution, but usually you simply say, this is my product and this is the price. If you want, you can buy it. In the service industry, it's not like that. Basically, you start by finding a client. Okay, a client approaches you to build some software for them. We call it bespoke development. And in that case, everything happens for that particular client only. The software that you are going to build, it is not a generalized software. It is a software catered to their needs, tailored to their needs. Okay, so at the end of your development, you are supposed to go and deploy the software on the client's premises, on the client's servers, or whatever it is. If they have a data center, you're supposed to deploy it there. If they have everything on the cloud, you are supposed to deploy it on the cloud. But the idea is you have to deploy it specifically for your client. So this is the difference between the software products and the service oriented solutions. Okay, any other queries, guys? Yeah, I know. If you were expecting these lectures to be coding intensive, you might actually be very disappointed. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure you are learning more coding in the data structures part. And this is why later in the course I will actually start teaching you those system building skills, just to keep this course interesting, right? You learn some new skills. You learn how to create GUIs, you learn how to create threads, and how to make connections across machines. I just hope that it will keep you interested enough in the course, because otherwise we are going to do a lot of non coding things in this course as well. Anyhow, any questions? Yeah, abstraction part is very important. Let me tell you what it means. Let me go to that slide. Mm. See, this abstraction thing, what happens is something like this. As a developer, this question will be there in front of you, maybe almost in all the projects that you will be involved with, right? Whether you have to write the code, or whether you are happy with borrowing the code from somewhere and using it. Okay, this is a dilemma, I would say, that each software developer has to go through at some point of time. Okay, what is the reason for this dilemma? um, in certain cases you might not trust a third party solution, right? Let me give you an example. I worked with ISRO. I told you guys, right, in the previous semester. So in ISRO, you do not have access to, at least at that time when I was there, we did not used to have internet access in the actual development labs. Okay, we were supposed to write code without any internet access. Not only that, it was not allowed for us to simply, and one of the reasons for this was we were not allowed to copy and paste code from the internet straight away into our applications. It was said that this could be dangerous, right? If you do not if you simply start copying stuff from internet and pasting it, it could be dangerous to do that. So each piece of code that you write in the application, it has to be trusted code. Trusted code as in you are responsible for it, right? I mean, if something goes wrong, you simply cannot say, oh, I simply copied it from the internet. No, that you are supposed to write that code on your own, or the libraries you use have to be trusted third party libraries only, right? So this level of abstraction is like that in any programming language, um, sometimes it is possible that the actual functionality you want, it is available as a library function, or you might want to write it on your own if you don't trust that library. So this level of abstraction is something on that line. In certain languages like C, the level of abstraction is very low. Okay, the actual number of libraries that you will get are not too high. So in, let us say, majority of the cases, you'll have to write a lot of custom code on your own. In languages like MATLAB, for example, almost everything is provided as a function, as a library function. Almost everything, even you know very weird, very complicated mathematical functions are already available in MATLAB. You can simply call a function and get your things done. So in MATLAB, you don't really need to, you can write the code on your own as well, by the way, but you don't need to. It's already there. So this level of abstraction is that basically these are two types of approaches. Imperative approach says that I actually care about how a particular job is being done, whereas the declarative approach says that I don't care how it is done as long as I get a solution for it. So this is an approach that you will see, that this is something that you will have to you know um make a decision of whenever you are building a system. It will depend on the severity of the system. It will depend on the risks associated with the system, but basically you have to decide upon a level of abstraction. Okay. And the choice of your programming language also affects your level of abstraction, because for certain programming languages there might be no library available at all for doing whatever you want, right? So in that case, you have no other choice but to write the code yourself. Whereas for some other programming languages there is a library available, but it's up to you whether you want to use it or not. Okay. So is it clearer now that what is the idea of level of abstraction? The idea is, whether you want to write the code or whether you want to simply use the code from somewhere else. And it is not just at the library level. In languages like Python, for example, even the language constructs are such that you can actually write a lot of code in a very simple statement. So I forgot what exactly is it called. So I'm not really a Python coder, but essentially there is a way in Python where you simply write the two extremes of the loop, let us say 1 to n, and then the loop gets created on its own. I'm There is a range function, if I'm not wrong, and with the help of that range function you can simply create a loop, right? You don't have to write things like for I equal to 0, I less than n, and so on and so forth. So these are all levels of abstractions that certain languages gives you higher levels of abstraction, but they take away the flexibility also. It is possible that while the library function is doing 90% of what you want, but you are giving up some flexibility in order to use it. Or you can simply write everything on your own and get 100% flexibility. So these are some dilemmas that as a developer you will have to face throughout your life. And usually you find a midway solution. It's neither too detailed nor too abstract. This is what we generally do. Any other question, guys? Oh yeah, just a minute. Don't worry about the class diagram as such. Basically, we will go through class diagram in detail, but let me just try to show it to you again. So the idea is, we'll know what a class is, but let us say you are building some solution for triple IT Lucknow. Okay. There is, let us say you're building some online solution for triple IT Lucknow, where students can register their courses. um, uh, uh, you know uh, you can figure out what is your timetable. There's like one integrated portal. We don't have it here in triple IT, but in many organizations we have, in many institutes we have such portals where all these things are integrated with each other. So what are the entities that are supposed to be represented on this portal? There is a student entity, there is a course entity, there is a faculty entity, and they have some relationship between them, right? A student has some attributes, right? A student has a name, a roll number, a semester. uh, a course has a course ID, the number of credits. The faculty who's teaching it, the faculty has an employee ID, so on and so forth. So these are some real world entities which are supposed to be represented on that portal, and they have some relationship between them, right? So for example, one course might be having more than one student, right? So there might be like 80 students or 240 students in one course. But the relationship between a faculty and a course is different. In general, usually a faculty will teach only one course, maybe at max two courses or three courses. I don't think so anyone can teach more than three courses in a semester. But for most cases it will be one faculty, one course, right? And similarly, one course usually will be taught by only one faculty member and not more than one. So this is a relationship. It is a relationship between the entities that you have in your system. So a class diagram tries to represent this, okay? And this is important when you start writing code. You have to figure out that these relationships are maintained in the code that you have written. So it should not be possible that the relationship between course and student actually gets reversed. Okay, so it should not be that one course has only one, okay, maybe I should have written M to N probably, right? Because a student also registers for multiple courses, so it should be like M to N, right? So one student can register for multiple courses, and one course can have multiple students. So this is actually not perfect, right? I mean, it has to be M to N. But the idea is that I have to figure out these relationships, that I have these entities in my code, in my world, and they have some relationships. These class diagrams are supposed to represent those relationships. We'll look at what class diagrams are in the course, but this is just to give you a brief idea of what exactly are we going to learn. Is it clear? Okay, any other questions? Don't worry guys, we'll I think we'll start in tomorrow's lecture. There will be some code. So all of you guys who are craving for some code, we'll start with code very soon, and that is why I'll keep in each week there will be some C++ and some designing, because otherwise um, usually people simply start with designing for the first 2 units or so and then start with code. I thought it will be too boring for you. So I'll actually mix up this designing part with the code part. So from next week onwards, we'll see some code and some design part. So just please stay with me. Don't just zone out. It's important stuff, right? You this designing stuff. It is this knowledge is going to be important for you when you go to industry. Okay. Any more queries? Mm. Um, so basically it's more of a you remember, right? In algorithms, what we used to say, that algorithms can be at different levels of abstraction. That in quadratic equation case, you can simply say, if you want to find the roots, find discriminant, and based on discriminant you can find the roots. This is also one way of writing the algorithm. The other way is you basically start by saying, okay, calculate b square, calculate 4ac, then calculate b square minus 4ac, then take the square root of it. This is the discriminant. If it is less than this, if it is more than that, so on and so forth, right? So this is a more detailed algorithm to do the same thing. So architecture and this detailed designing using, let us say, UML, it is the same thing. Okay, architecture is at a much higher level, and these detailed designs are at a much detailed level. So that is why I said they are like the algorithms counterpart when you are building a system. The only thing that differs is the level of detail. Okay, so you usually start with architectural designs. Architectural design, I don't think this is the right term. Architectural diagrams or views, and then you go down and you create even more detailed versions. Okay, any other queries? Okay, so yeah, we are almost on time. So the lab part I have told you, your TAs will contact you for the lab. Okay, and we'll formally start with C++ labs, I think, from the next week. This week I'll just give you some practice question on C. Try to write the code for it. If you get stuck, talk to your TAs. Okay, they are going to be your mentors for this semester. Okay, guys, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.